convicted is life with the possibility of parole at the judge's discretion. Then we've got manslaughter while under the influence of alcohol. Rick, you touched on that. That's 5 to 20 years. So there's a mandatory minimum of at least 5 with that one. And count 3 is leaving the scene of an accident or personal injury. 2.5 is the mandatory minimum to 10 is the penalty on that one. And the defendant we know is out on bond and has been since early on in this case. John DePetro, you covered the first trial extensively. You were one of the members of the media sitting in the courtroom watching this case, outside the courthouse like you are today, watching things. In your opinion, what do you think the Commonwealth needs to do differently in round 2?
Julie, I think Hank Brennan is going to deliver an opening argument for the ages. And Paul O'Keefe, in his words, Karen Reed turned this into the Karen Reed show. We saw her coming in, and she's got her cheering fans like she's going to a film premiere. I think Hank Brennan, we've talked about all these interviews that she's done. I'm very curious to see the clip that he's going to use in opening arguments of Karen Reed. And what I think is going to be so dramatic is as the defendant is sitting there and she's silent, the first introduction to the jury will be the exact words of Karen Reed. Now, Julie, also something to watch for. We've seen a lot of the interviews that she's done. We've also seen that docuseries, Body in the Snow. But the prosecution, the Commonwealth, Hank Brennan, they also have access to footage that was shot that they didn't use in the docuseries. So she said some things that I thought were pretty incriminating in that Body in the Snow. She talked about, she was talking with David Yannetti and what's my culpability and what if I ran over his foot and what if I banged into him. Now, those are things that were said on the camera used in the docuseries. I'm curious to see what Hank Brennan is possibly going to use that was said that they shot but it weren't used. Something also to watch. Hank Brennan, Julie, has talked about this is a data case. And what we're really going to hear, and this is such a 2025 type of case, is that John O'Keefe's cell phone was always within reach. It was with him in the car. It was with him when he got out of the car. I believe the prosecution is going to paint this picture for the jury that wherever John O'Keefe went, that phone went, and wherever that phone went, that is the key possibly to what happened to John O'Keefe.
John, excellent points. Picking up right where you left off, because you said something that made me hearken back to one of those pretrial hearings with Hank Brennan. I know you're going to remember this, John, where he talked about the temperature of the phone, something we didn't hear the first time around. I know you remember that, the phone, the movements, and also the car data. John, refresh our memory, please. Hank Brennan did some new testing, did he not, on Karen Reed's Lexus? Am I right about that?
That is exactly right, Julie. And that's why I believe this case is going to be ground zero from when John O'Keefe stepped out of that Lexus. I don't think we're going to hear anything about him going into the house because we don't have the evidence. There's no evidence of him going inside the house. As far as the cell phone data, the cell phone has a certain temperature that it keeps. Now, if he had gone inside of a house, then the temperature would have risen with the cell phone, but it never happened. So I think the cell phone data, and it's so remarkable when people think about it. And by the way, DNA has been a new element of past several years now where it's really used in trials. Well, the same thing goes for extraction of cell phones and also the Lexus. He was never that far from the Lexus. They have her movements in the Lexus. I think that puts the defense in a box, and this has got to be much different than David Yannetti last spring announcing Karen Reed was framed. Now, we do have some unfinished business because Alan Jackson, he wants to introduce that autopsy photo that shows John O'Keefe's arm, we believe, cut by the taillight. They're trying to argue dog bites. It still remains to be seen whether or not that's going to be allowed. But I believe that this is going to be Hank Brennan on the offensive. And what I'm very anxious to see is the impression of the jury when they see the defendant sitting right there in her own words and essentially framing the rest of the trial.
Yes, John, I think you're exactly right. First impressions, we know, are everything. Opening statements matter so much. Something I learned when I did my LLM in trial advocacy is that the statistics show that